I did actually make some progress last night after my recording. First thing I did was I grabbed a Vice snapshot of Pandora on the Commodore 64 using Vice, of course, and imported that into SpritePad, which is a Commodore 64 sprite extractor. Found where all the Pandora Commodore 64 sprites were, extracted all of those, and then used Microsoft Paint, yes, on a PC, which is not fun. Then cropped the player sprites out and dragged those into Texture Packer, and then used that to export the player sprites one by one. And then I took the first 4 sprites into ProMotion and removed the background, shifted them down 1 pixel, and now I've got to do the same again for the remaining 12 sprites. There were 16 sprites. That's 4 steps of the player animation in 4 cardinal directions. And the original sprites were all drawn 12 across by 21 down. And they are double width, so when you extract them, they've got to be 24 by 21 down, and a fair amount of that vertical space is not used when the sprites are going up and down. So the next thing will be to clear the rest of the sprites, import those into Godot engine, see how that goes, move the sprite around, see what happens. And once I've managed to get it moving around, see what it's like with a normal map, and then if that works, eventually create a sprite sheet so that I'm not wasting draw calls. Now, it strikes me that this whole process is incredibly tedious, and that's one of the things that stops me from making progress, because I like everything to have low friction. One of the biggest breakthroughs in reducing friction that the video games industry ever saw was a tool called PDS, Programmer Development System, back in the mid-80s, created by Andrew Glaister and Phu Katan. Before that, you had to load an assembler, usually off tape, sometimes off disk, sometimes the floppy disk was even slower than a cassette tape. I kid you not, the Commodore 1541 floppy drive was abysmal. The Atari 800 floppy drive was not much better. As for the Atari cassette drive, well, let's not say anything about that. So you load up your assembler, let's say it was DevPack on the Spectrum, and then you would load up your source code, and then you would assemble your game, then you would load your game after it had been saved, and then you would run it, and then it would crash, and then you would start again. Now, this got so tedious for Chimera that I actually wrote my own turbo loader to speed things up from 1500 bits per second to, I don't know, something like 2400 bits per second. Every bit counts. So when PDS arrived and I got to see it, it was a complete game changer. Up until then, many of us were writing games on the actual target hardware. When PDS came, you wrote on a beautiful Apricot PC, which was kind of like a PC type thing, but it wasn't running a Microsoft operating system. And the PDS software was blazingly fast. You could load up 8 files of, I think they were 32K eventually. I don't know how much they were in PDS1. I worked on PDS2, by the way, but I'll come to that. So you could have 8 windows, 8 files, an enormous amount of code. It would assemble your entire game in a matter of seconds, as opposed to minutes. And then it would squirt it down using its own proprietary hardware and software to the target machine in seconds. So the turnaround time went from 10, 15, 20 minutes to 10 seconds. Absolute game changer. So you did everything in PDS except for your sprites. And it just meant that when things broke, you were able to fix things extremely quickly. Now, I've not seen anything like it since. I worked on PDS too. I worked on the graphics editor. I worked on the text editor, added things like a nested Control G. There'll be an article soon about this, not by me. I've contributed to it. I'll point you to it eventually. And I also worked on the Connex development system. PDS2, I think, was when the competition started to catch up and take over. So you had the likes of Snasm, early days of Snasm. Anyway, there's never been anything quite that brilliant, and I wish there was something like that now. Godot is fine, don't get me wrong. You can do things fairly quickly, but it was a simplicity. You know, you had a screen, you had to go straight to the screen, and you had code to do that. And you wrote everything from scratch, and everything was fast. Everything was in assembler. You knew exactly where you stood. You didn't have to learn another API, how somebody else thinks. You only had to know how you thought and how you built stuff, and then you built it and you released it, and it was good. I would like to be able to get back to that. I'm not sure it's possible or practical. I know people think I'm absolutely nuts, but there's something to be said about not having to learn yet another API, because once you get on that API train, you're never getting off. You're going to have to learn somebody else's API, then your API gets out of date, then the hardware changes, then the underlying software changes, the operating system changes, and you're back on the merry-go-round, forever chasing your tail, never really doing the thing that you really want to do, which was to express yourself directly onto a machine. There's something to be said about that. I miss it, and I wish there was a way of somehow getting back to that. I'm not sure that there is, but if you know a way, let me know. I might be up for that. Until tomorrow, God bless.